Hello everyone. Before we jump in, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe. And don't forget to drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep showing you amazing stories just like this one. All right, let's get started. I never thought I'd be the type of person to write on forums like this, but after what happened last year, I don't really know how else to deal with it. Even now, typing this out, I'm looking over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see something standing there. I live in a small town in Pennsylvania. Not much goes on here except for the usual gossip, the weekend football games, and the occasional tragedy that keeps people whispering for a few months. The cemetery at the edge of town has always been part of our landscape. It's not huge, but it's old, older than anything else around here. Most of the graves are from the 1800s, with headstones so weathered, you can barely make out the names. As kids, we used to dare each other to spend 10 minutes inside after dark. I never lost one of those dares. But things change when you grow older. I started walking through the cemetery at night just to clear my head. I'd tell myself it wasn't about the dead, that I just liked the quiet, the way the moonlight cast long shadows between the rows of stones, the way the world felt muted. Peaceful, in a strange way. It became a habit. Then one night, I noticed a grave I swear wasn't there before. It was late September, chilly but not freezing. I had my hoodie pulled tight, headphones around my neck but not playing anything. I liked listening to the night sounds. I was following my usual path past the big oak tree in the center of the cemetery when I saw it. A fresh grave. The dirt was piled unevenly, dark against the pale grass. There was no headstone, no flowers, nothing to mark who it belonged to, just a raw wound in the earth like someone had dug it recently. I stopped in my tracks. I'd walked this path every night for weeks. I knew this cemetery like the back of my hand. That grave hadn't been there yesterday. I crouched down, shining my phone's flashlight on it. The soil was damp, as though it had been dug that very evening. My stomach twisted. There hadn't been a funeral, not in this town. Everyone knows when someone dies. It's impossible not to. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I just overlooked it before. Maybe it had been covered with leaves or shadows. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I snapped a picture on my phone and headed home earlier than usual. The next morning, I showed the picture to my mom. She frowned. "There wasn't a funeral," she said firmly. "And that cemetery hasn't accepted new burials in decades. It's been closed off." That made the knot in my stomach tighten. If the cemetery wasn't accepting burials, who had dug that grave? I went back the following night. The grave was still there, but it looked different. The dirt had settled, like something heavy was pressing down from beneath. I tried to convince myself it was just gravity, the way soil shifts after it's disturbed. But then I saw the footprints. They circled the grave, pressed deep into the soft dirt. Bare footprints. I froze. The prints weren't mine, and they weren't walking toward the grave, they were walking away. From that point on, things started to spiral. I couldn't stay away. Every night I found myself drifting back to that spot, staring at the unmarked grave. Some nights the footprints would be fresh, as though someone had walked around it just moments before I arrived. Other nights, I swore I saw the soil shifting like something was moving underneath. And then came the voices. The first time I heard them, I thought it was the wind. A low whisper that seemed to curl around my ears. But it wasn't random, it formed words. My name. Over and over. Ethan. That's my name. Ethan. I stumbled back, scanning the rows of stones, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The cemetery was empty, completely still. The second time I heard laughter. Childlike, distant but unmistakable. I bolted, running all the way home, lungs burning. I told myself I'd never go back. But I did. I don't know what compelled me. Curiosity, maybe. Or something deeper, like I was being pulled there. Every night, against my better judgment, I returned. And every night the activity escalated. Whispers grew into full sentences. Pleas for help, desperate cries, guttural moans that shook me to my core. I started seeing shapes too. Out of the corner of my eye, pale figures flickering between the headstones. I'd whip my head around and they'd vanish. One night I saw a woman standing at the edge of the fresh grave. Her hair was long and tangled, her dress filthy. Her face was turned away from me, but I could see her lips moving. She was whispering into the grave. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then slowly, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were nothing but empty sockets. I ran, stumbling over headstones, not daring to look back. When I got home, I locked every door, every window, and sat in the dark with the lights off, shaking. For a while, I avoided the cemetery, but the nightmares didn't stop. I'd dream of the grave, of hands clawing out of the soil, of whispers filling my room. Sometimes I'd wake up to find dirt on my bedsheets, small clumps scattered across the floor. Finally, I snapped. I decided I needed answers. One afternoon, I went to the town library. The cemetery records were old, tucked away in dusty binders. I flipped through page after page, looking for anything, any recent burial, any anomaly. Nothing. Then I found an old newspaper clipping from 1974. The headline made my blood run cold. Local boy missing after cemetery dare. Body never recovered. The boy's name? Ethan. My name. The article described a 12-year-old who vanished one night after being dared to spend an hour in the cemetery. His friends claimed they left him there as a joke, but when they returned, he was gone. The police searched for weeks. The only sign they found was a freshly dug grave with no body inside. The article ended with a chilling line. The grave was filled in the next day, though no official records explain who did it. I sat there, frozen, the clipping trembling in my hands. My stomach churned. This wasn't possible. I was alive. I had parents, friends, a whole life. But the dreams, the dirt, the whispers calling my name. That night, against all reason, I went back to the cemetery one last time. The grave was waiting, fresh again, open this time. The soil piled neatly beside it as though inviting me in. And inside the grave, I saw a body. It was me, rotting, lifeless, my own face staring back at me with hollow eyes. I stumbled backward, choking on air, my vision spinning. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, surrounding me, suffocating me. And through it all, one thought pounded in my skull. I wasn't supposed to exist. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where everything revolved around the school, the church, and the endless fields of corn that seemed to stretch forever. When I was a teenager, the place I dreaded most was Willow Hill Cemetery. It wasn't the kind of cemetery with neat rows and manicured lawns. It was old, forgotten, half swallowed by weeds and wild trees. The gravestones leaned at odd angles, their names eroded by rain and wind. Some had cracked down the middle, and others were so covered in moss they looked like nothing more than boulders. No one ever visited, at least no one living. The cemetery had its legends. Kids whispered about the Willow Hill Children, a group of orphans who supposedly died in a fire at the nearby orphanage in the early 1900s. According to the stories, their bodies had been buried together in a mass grave at the far end of the cemetery. Some kids said you could still hear their laughter at night. Others swore you'd see small handprints in the dirt if you stayed too long. But I never believed any of that. Not until I saw it for myself. It started the summer after my junior year of high school. My best friend Tyler was the one who dragged me out there. He was the kind of guy who lived for dares, for proving he wasn't afraid of anything. One sticky July night, after too many sodas and not enough sense, he suggested we sneak out and spend the night in Willow Hill. "We'll prove the stories are crap," he said, grinning like a maniac. I wanted to say no, but I also didn't want to be the coward. So I agreed. We hopped the rusted fence around midnight, flashlights in hand. The cemetery was silent, suffocatingly so. Even the crickets seemed to have gone quiet. We walked deeper, our beams of light bouncing across the crooked stones until we reached the far edge where the trees closed in thick and dark. That's when we saw it, the mass grave. It wasn't marked with a headstone like the others. Instead, it was a wide, low mound of earth, the grass growing patchy and uneven across it. At its center stood a wooden cross, weathered and splintered, its arms sagging as if weighed down by time itself. Tyler chuckled nervously and kicked at the dirt. "Guess this is it," he muttered. I felt a chill run through me even though the night air was warm. I wanted to leave, but Tyler dared me to sit on the mound. "5 minutes," he said, "and we're legends." Against my better judgment, I did. The soil beneath me felt softer than I expected, almost spongy, as though it hadn't settled even after all these years. I told myself it was nothing, but my skin crawled. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of giggles. Soft, high-pitched, unmistakably the sound of children laughing. I jumped to my feet, my flashlight jerking wildly across the grave. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding us, echoing in the still night. Tyler's grin faltered. "Probably just other kids messing with us," he said, but his voice wavered. Then the handprints appeared. At first they were faint, pressed into the dirt around the mound, small, like a child's. Then more of them appeared, dozens, as if invisible children were crawling out of the earth itself. The soil shifted, the grass bending as though tiny bodies were moving just beneath the surface. I felt bile rise in my throat. "We need to go," I whispered, grabbing Tyler's arm. But Tyler shook me off. "No way," he said, trying to sound brave, though his eyes darted around in panic. "We're just freaking ourselves out." The giggles grew louder, higher, more frantic. Then came the whispers. Hundreds of voices overlapping, chanting words I couldn't understand. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the moon, silver and cold, illuminating the mound of earth that was now moving. Something was pushing up from beneath. The soil bulged, cracked, split open. Small hands, gray, skeletal, with bits of dirt clinging to them, burst through the surface. One hand, then another, then dozens. Tyler screamed. I froze, paralyzed, as the children pulled themselves out of the ground. Their faces were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their skin as pale as ash. But they were smiling, wide, unnatural smiles that stretched too far across their faces. They didn't speak. They laughed. The sound drilled into my skull, shrill and endless. Tyler bolted, sprinting back toward the fence. I followed, stumbling over broken stones, my lungs burning. I didn't dare look back, not until we reached the fence and scrambled over it, collapsing onto the other side. When I finally turned, the cemetery was silent again. Empty. We didn't talk about it for weeks, neither of us wanted to. But something had changed in Tyler. He stopped sleeping. His eyes grew hollow, ringed with shadows. When I asked him what was wrong, he said he kept hearing them, the children. At night, in his room, whispering, giggling, scratching at his windows. His mom said he was having nightmares. I knew better. Then one morning, Tyler was gone. His bed was empty, his window wide open. The police searched for days but found nothing. The only clue was a trail of small, muddy footprints leading from his backyard into the woods. They disappeared halfway, swallowed by the earth. I tried to move on, but I couldn't. I avoided the cemetery, avoided even driving past it. Yet the children found me too. At night, I'd wake to the sound of laughter, faint at first, then louder, closer. Sometimes I'd find small handprints smeared across my bedroom mirror, or dirt scattered across my sheets. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't matter. The worst was the dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream at all. I woke one night to find myself lying on the mound in Willow Hill Cemetery, the soil cold and damp beneath me. Dozens of pale faces stared down at me, grinning, their hollow eyes unblinking. They whispered in unison, their voices like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Stay with us." I screamed and jerked awake, back in my own bed, drenched in sweat. But there was dirt under my fingernails. I don't know why I'm writing this now, except that I need someone to know. Tyler isn't the only one they've taken. I've seen posts online, stories of people vanishing near old cemeteries across the state, always near mass graves, always with the same detail: children's laughter. Last night I heard scratching at my door. This time, when I looked, there were dozens of tiny handprints smeared across the wood. They're not waiting outside anymore, they're coming in. If you ever find yourself near Willow Hill Cemetery, don't go near the mound. Don't listen to the laughter. Don't let them see you. Because once they do, they'll never stop following you, and when they finally get you, you won't just disappear. You'll join them. I used to work night shifts as a security guard, mostly bouncing between warehouses and construction sites. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I didn't mind the quiet. About 4 years ago, though, I landed what I thought would be the easiest gig of all, watching over a cemetery just outside of town. My boss made it sound like a joke. "Nobody's gonna rob the dead," he laughed, handing me the keys to the small caretaker's office at the edge of the property. I remember thinking he was right. I'd just sit there in the office with my thermos of coffee, do a few patrols between the headstones, and collect a paycheck for basically doing nothing. That's what I believed. The cemetery itself wasn't massive, but it had a kind of weight to it, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up even in broad daylight. The graves dated back to the 1800s, with tall angel statues that had eroded into grotesque shapes and mossy crypts built into the hillside. The first night I walked the grounds, I felt a pressure in the air, like the atmosphere was thicker there. But I told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone, in the dark, in a cemetery. It would have been weirder if I hadn't been spooked. Things went smoothly for the first week. I'd make my rounds every hour, shining my flashlight between the rows of graves, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of the highway. Sometimes I'd hear a fox yelping or an owl hooting, and I'd chuckle at how easily a sound could set my nerves on edge. Nothing out of the ordinary happened, until one night I noticed the caretaker's shed had its light on. That was strange because I was the only one with keys. The caretaker who used to live on site had passed away a decade earlier, and the shed had been converted into a little break room for whoever was on duty. I hadn't touched the light that night, I was sure of it. Slowly, cautiously, I walked over. The window glowed faintly yellow, the bulb buzzing inside. When I pushed the door open, the light clicked off on its own. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears. I swept my flashlight across the room, but it was empty. Just the old wooden desk, the chair, the rusting thermos left behind by some guard before me. No movement, no sound. I closed the door and locked it behind me, telling myself it must have been faulty wiring. But the next night, the light was on again, and this time, the door was unlocked. Inside, the chair had been pulled out from the desk, angled toward the window, as though someone had been sitting there watching the graves. A pack of cigarettes lay on the desk, the kind I knew hadn't been manufactured in decades. The paper had yellowed, the logo faded. My skin prickled as I realized they looked old. Too old. I decided I wasn't going to sit around playing games. I did my rounds quickly that night and left as soon as my shift ended. The following evening, I showed up with a fresh determination to prove I wasn't crazy. I checked the shed first thing. Everything was exactly how I'd left it, the chair tucked under the desk, the cigarettes gone. But scrawled across the dusty window, as though by a fingertip, was a single word: stay. After that, the nights bled together in a blur of unease. I started hearing footsteps crunching in the gravel when I knew I was alone. Sometimes I'd see a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still between the rows of graves, only for it to vanish when I blinked. Other times I'd hear humming, an old tune, scratchy and low, drifting on the night air. I started sleeping during the day with my ears ringing from the silence, the phantom noises still playing in my head. One night around 3 a.m., I heard the office phone ring. Nobody had ever called during my shift. I let it ring twice before picking it up, my voice tight with nerves. "Hello?" For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a man's voice, hoarse and thin. "You shouldn't be here." The line went dead. I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. My boss brushed it off when I mentioned it the next morning, telling me kids probably messed with the line. But the voice hadn't sounded like a prank. It had sounded ancient. The breaking point came about a month in. I was doing my patrol, flashlight beam bouncing across the rows, when I saw smoke curling upward near the caretaker's shed. My stomach dropped. I thought maybe it was on fire. I sprinted over, but when I reached it, I saw it wasn't fire at all. Someone was sitting in the chair inside, cigarette glowing faintly between their fingers. For a second, I thought it was another guard I hadn't been told about. But when I shone my light through the window, the man didn't move. He just sat there, hunched over, staring at the graveyard. His clothes were out of place, old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. Worn suspenders, a loose shirt, a hat pulled low. His skin sagged in a way that wasn't right, like it had been stretched too thin. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Slowly he turned his head, and even through the glass, even in the dim light, I'll never forget what I saw. His eyes were gone, just hollow sockets, dark and endless, and yet I felt them lock on mine. The cigarette dropped from his hand, crumbling into ash before it hit the floor. Then the light inside flickered and died, plunging the shed into blackness. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from the cemetery, didn't bother finishing my rounds, didn't lock up, nothing. The next day, I quit. Told my boss I wasn't cut out for the job. He looked at me strangely but didn't argue. I thought leaving would end it. But the cemetery didn't let me go. Nights later, as I tried to sleep, I smelled cigarette smoke in my bedroom. My apartment is non-smoking, I live alone, and the scent was unmistakable. I sat up, heart hammering, and there he was, sitting in the chair in the corner of my room, hat shadowing his face, smoke curling from a cigarette that burned without flame. I blinked, and he was gone. It's been years now, but the smoke never leaves me. Some nights I'll wake coughing, the taste of ash thick in my mouth, the faint outline of a man fading from the corner of the room. I don't tell anyone anymore. They wouldn't believe me. But sometimes late at night when I drive past the cemetery, I see the shed light flicker on. And I know he's still there, watching, waiting. When I was younger, I never believed in ghosts. I thought cemeteries were just sad places where families came to remember, not the kinds of places where the dead actually stirred. That belief changed the year my cousin Darren died. He was only 19 when a car accident took his life, and our whole family was wrecked by it. The funeral was held in the oldest cemetery in town, one I had never been to before. It was the kind of place that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The iron gates rusted through, the headstones leaning crooked, vines twisting over everything like nature was trying to reclaim it. I remember thinking the whole place felt wrong, like the air inside those gates was heavier than anywhere else. At the funeral, I kept feeling like someone was watching me. Not just me, all of us. The priest spoke, the family cried, and yet I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on my back. When I turned around, though, there was no one there. Just rows of graves stretching into the distance. I told myself grief was playing tricks on me. But the real horror didn't begin until weeks later. One night, maybe around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name. At first I thought it was a dream, but when I opened my eyes, the whisper was still there. Soft, stretched thin, but clear. Michael, My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I lived alone. No one should have been in my apartment. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The whisper came again, this time from the corner of the room. I flicked on the lamp, but the corner was empty, just shadows. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and when morning came, I tried to rationalize it. Stress. Fatigue. Maybe I'd been dreaming with my eyes open. But the whispers came back the next night, and the night after that. Always around 2 a.m., always saying my name. Sometimes it sounded like Darren's voice. Sometimes it sounded like something else. Something deeper, too low and guttural to belong to any person. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got in my car and drove. No destination in mind, just needing to get away from my apartment. Without realizing it, my car took me to the cemetery. Darren's cemetery. I pulled up outside those rusted gates, and though every instinct screamed at me to turn back, I went in. The air was cold and damp, though it was midsummer. My breath fogged in front of me as I followed the gravel path toward Darren's grave. That's when I saw it. My name carved into one of the old headstones. Not Darren's. Not anyone's I recognized. Just my name. Michael, etched deep into the stone. I froze. The headstone was crumbling, old enough that it should have been illegible. But my name looked fresh, as though it had been carved yesterday. I stumbled backward, flashlight trembling in my hands. That's when I heard it again. My name, whispered on the wind. But this time, it wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from beneath the ground. The earth shifted slightly at my feet, a faint bulge like something pressing up from below. I ran that night, faster than I'd ever run before. But when I got home, I realized the whispers had followed me. They weren't tied to the cemetery anymore. They were tied to me. Every night at 2 a.m. they grew louder, closer, until I swore I could feel breath against my ear. I stopped sleeping. My eyes burned from exhaustion. My hands shook constantly. My friends noticed, but what could I tell them? That the dead were whispering my name. One night, desperate for answers, I returned to the cemetery. I told myself I'd find Darren's grave, sit there and try to talk to him. Maybe this was his spirit, trying to reach me. Maybe it wasn't as sinister as it felt. But when I arrived, Darren's grave was gone. I don't mean it was vandalized or moved, I mean it literally wasn't there. Where his stone had been was now an empty patch of dirt. No sign of his name, no flowers, no fresh soil. As if he had never been buried there at all. In his place was a new headstone. My headstone. My name again. My birth year. And beneath it, a death year, this year. My body locked up. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The ground beneath my feet trembled. And I knew if I stayed even a second longer, something would reach up and pull me under. I fled, not daring to look back. For weeks after, I tried to ignore it. I burned sage. I slept with music blasting. I even moved apartments. Nothing helped. The whispers followed me everywhere. In my car, in the grocery store, even in the middle of the day. Always the same voice, always calling my name. I stopped answering my phone because sometimes, when it rang, all I'd hear on the other end was breathing. Last night was the worst. I woke up to find dirt scattered across my bedroom floor. Fresh dirt, damp, smelling of earth and decay. At the center of the pile was a small piece of stone, jagged and rough. When I picked it up, I realized it was part of a headstone, and carved into it was the letter M. I don't know how much time I have left. The whispers are louder now, not just saying my name, but urging me. Come back. Come home. I feel a pressure in my chest like something is pulling me down, like gravity itself is trying to bury me alive. I don't go near cemeteries anymore, but I don't think it matters, because the grave with my name on it isn't waiting in the ground anymore, it's following me. And I'm terrified the next time I close my eyes I won't wake up. I'll wake there. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. where the old Oak Ridge Cemetery stood like a sentinel on the edge of town. The place was massive, rolling hills covered with weathered stones, some leaning at crooked angles, others hidden by ivy that had swallowed entire rows of markers. For most people in town, Oak Ridge was just another graveyard, a quiet patch of land where the dead rested. But for me, it became something far darker, something I can't explain without my hands shaking even now. It started on a dare. I was 19, restless, and trying to prove myself to a group of friends who thought it was hilarious to spook one another. One summer night, we were sitting around a bonfire when someone brought up the Oak Ridge legend. Supposedly, people had seen a figure there, always in black, always standing at a distance, watching. Some called it the Watcher. My friends laughed it off, but one of them turned to me and said, "If you're really as fearless as you claim, spend a night out there." I didn't hesitate. I was cocky back then. A night in a cemetery? Easy. But from the moment I climbed the rusted gates that night, I realized Oak Ridge wasn't what I thought. The air was unnaturally still, like the world beyond those gates no longer existed. Even the crickets went silent. My flashlight flickered, though the batteries were new, and the beam seemed swallowed by the darkness like the night itself was thicker inside. I wandered deeper, past rows of tilting stones, and finally picked a spot near a massive oak tree that stretched high into the black sky. I laid out my sleeping bag but couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. The silence pressed against me, heavy and suffocating. That's when I first saw it, far across the cemetery, near the chapel ruins. A tall figure, motionless, wrapped in something dark. It stood like a statue, too still, too deliberate. I froze, convincing myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the moonlight. But when I blinked, it had moved closer. No footsteps, no sound, just closer. My pulse hammered in my ears. I gripped my flashlight tighter and shouted, "Who's there?" My voice cracked, sounding weaker than I intended. No answer. Just that figure standing perfectly still, its face hidden in shadow. I decided to be brave, or stupid depending on how you see it, and marched toward it. Each step crunched against dead leaves, echoing far louder than they should have. The figure didn't move. But when I was about 20 feet away, my flashlight flickered again, sputtering, and in the brief darkness, it vanished. My breath caught. I whipped the light around, desperate to spot it again, and there it was, behind me, at least 50 yards back, closer to where I'd left my sleeping bag. I swear on everything I love, there's no way it could have gotten there without me hearing or seeing it move. I ran back toward the gates, heart pounding, only to realize the figure was always ahead of me, no matter which path I took. Sometimes near the chapel, sometimes at the base of the oak, sometimes standing between the rows of stones like it had been waiting all along. Finally, I stumbled back to the oak tree and pressed myself against the bark, too terrified to move. My flashlight gave one last sputter and died, plunging me into complete blackness. That's when I heard it, whispering. Not one voice, but dozens. Male, female, young, old, all murmuring in unison. My name was among them. Over and over they whispered it so soft and close I felt the breath on my skin. I bolted. I don't even remember how I got over the gate. My hands were cut and bleeding from the rusted iron. My knees scraped raw, but I didn't stop running until I was halfway back to town. My friends thought it was hilarious when I burst into the house, pale and shaking, but when they saw the gashes on my arms, their laughter died. I swore I'd never go back. But here's the twist, the part I can't explain, the part that keeps me up at night. A week later, my mom called me into the living room. "Honey," she said, "do you know this person?" She handed me an old photograph she'd found in my grandmother's things. It was taken in Oak Ridge Cemetery sometime in the 1940s. In the background, standing by the old oak tree, was the same tall figure in black. The worst part? My grandmother had written a note on the back of the picture. "The Watcher always follows our family." And I think she was right, because sometimes when I glance out of my window late at night, I swear I see a figure standing at the edge of the streetlight's glow, watching, always watching. When my grandmother died, she left me two things that didn't make much sense at the time: a battered cedar chest of family letters and a key on a frayed ribbon. The key was heavy and cold when I first touched it, the kind that belonged to an old gate or a long-closed trunk. On the ribbon, someone had tied a scrap of paper with one word in my grandmother's precise, looping handwriting: ledger. I grew up 2 states away, in a place where the oldest building looked like it was 10 years new, so the idea of a ledger felt like a relic from someone else's life. But my grandmother had always been a keeper of things: secrets, recipes, the names of relatives no one else remembered. So when I found an address tucked into one of the letters pointing to the old Prospect Cemetery, I drove down that weekend to see what the key might open. The cemetery sat like a forgotten island on the edge of our town, hemmed in by a run of pines and an old sagging stone wall. Prospect wasn't picturesque. It was the kind of place writers use when they want weathered stones and crooked ironwork in the background. It smelled of wet loam and rust and something older that I couldn't quite name. The caretaker's shed crouched near the center like a tired animal, paint peeled off in ribbons. My key fit the padlock with the awful ease of something meant to be opened, and inside, among jars of screws and coils of rope, I found it: an oak desk with a single drawer, and within that drawer, a book bound in cracked leather: the sexton's ledger. The ledger's pages had been written in by more than one hand. Columns listed names, dates of burial, brief notations: infant, stillborn, no marker. The handwriting ranged from careful cursive to a frantic slanted scrawl. But there was a rhythm to it, an obsessive, meticulous organization. My grandmother's scrap of paper had another word penciled beneath ledger: read. So I sat down on the shed's single-knot stool and read. At first it was ordinary. Names of people I knew in the town, their grandparents, a Civil War veteran marked with a penciled cross, a robbery victim from the 1980s. Then I noticed the hand that had added small slashes beside some names. The slashes were thin and repeated, like tally marks, always counted in groups of 5. Beside more recent entries, the slashes were darker, press of the pen firmer, as if whoever added them had pressed harder with the weight of purpose. When I glanced up and down the margins, some entries had annotations like late at night or no kin claimed. My stomach went cold when I realized the tally marks always stopped the night before something else was written: a new name, a new entry, sometimes a single line of script: buried 2:10 a.m. I took a photograph of the ledger with my phone and promised myself I'd return the next day, but the ledger wanted me to stay. That night I slept in my car at the edge of the cemetery, half because it felt improper to take the book with me, half because something in the way the ledger recorded the dead kept turning over in my head. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of someone moving outside the car. At first I thought it was a raccoon. Then I heard the distinct scrape of leather on gravel, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. They came and went in a way that made me feel watched, like the cemetery itself had leaned in. I pressed my hood over my face and tried to tell myself I was imagining things. When I went back to the shed at dawn, the ledger was open to a page I'd not reached before. A new name had been added in fresh ink: Mason Whitmore, buried 03/09, 2:14 a.m. Beneath it, in a hand I could only describe as identical to my grandmother's looping script, someone had written a single word: counted. And beside that, 5 fresh tally marks. There was no funeral listed in the paper the next day, no obituary, and the town's online bulletin had nothing. I asked around and people shrugged, disinterested. "We don't get many late-night burials," the mayor said, half smiling. "Old places like Prospect have their own customs, I suppose." Obsessed doesn't describe the way that ledger took over me. I started showing up at the shed at odd hours, watching the rows of stones like you might watch a television you can't turn off. Each time I checked the ledger, I found slight differences, an extra slash here, a note there, a tiny smudge of wet ink that had dried in a pattern almost like a fingerprint. Names that hadn't been there before began to appear, some in the hand of someone long gone, others in a new, hurried script that made my teeth ache to look at. Most disturbing of all, every time a name appeared, there would be a line beneath it with a time, always between 2:00 and 3 hours a.m., and then I saw my own name. It was small, tucked between two other entries, the letters cramped as if they'd been forced to fit. E. Carter, buried, 02 to 12, 2:27 a.m. The initials matched my middle name. My breath left me. For hours I sat with the ledger open and the keys cold in my lap, staring at those letters like they were a coin that might reveal a secret if I turned it just right. I looked for a note, a slashed tally, anything that might tell me whether it was a mistake, a joke. There was nothing, just my initials and a blank space where the date number was smudged, as though someone had tried and failed to write it. The next night, I slept in the shed. I told myself I would confront whoever was doing this, that there was a simple explanation. I woke around 2, not because of a sound but because the ledger seemed to hum beneath my palm. On the page opposite my initials, the ink had changed. A single tally mark had been added, as stealthy and slow as breath, and when I turned the page, my stomach dropped. The next entry was a name I knew from the letters in my grandmother's chest, a girl who'd disappeared from town 50 years ago. Beside her name was written, "Returned." I left the shed and walked under the cold stars until I reached her grave. The grass around it had been freshly disturbed. The shovel lay near the footstone, the metal blade smeared with earth as if used not long ago. The grave itself looked older somehow, as though the dirt had been replaced in a hurry and then tamped down. I vomited onto the gravel and felt my knees buckle. When I looked up, a figure stood beneath the trees, small, hunched, the silhouette of someone who'd kept watch for decades. The figure tilted its head. In the moonlight, I could see the outline of an old man's cap, the shadow of a face that did not belong to any living person I knew. He raised a hand that trembled and tapped the ledger clutched to his chest. "You readin' it?" he rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves. "You know what it says?" I wanted to run. Instead, I asked the question that had been burning in me. "What is this book?" He smiled like someone who'd expected the question for a long time. "This here's the ledger of the sexton," he said. "They keep count." He didn't say who they were, but the wetness in his eyes made his next words feel like an accusation and a mercy all at once. Names get written, names get counted. Some come back, some don't. The tally's for the taking. I demanded to know why my initials were on the page. The old man's smile fell away. He reached into his coat and produced an old fountain pen, its nib stained dark, and handed it to me without a word. His gnarled finger tapped the tip, and when I looked down at my hands, ink had smeared across my palm in a pattern that matched the smudge on the ledger. My heart hammered. I tried to lift my fingers, but they felt rooted, like I'd been kneeling in soil for 100 years. "You don't remember," he murmured, and the words landed like a shovel. "They only show you what you've done after the counting's done. Gives you a chance to see it for what it was." He reached closer, and for a second the moonlight revealed the ledger's page reflected in his pupils. In the margin in my grandmother's handwriting, there was a single note. "Don't bury yourself twice." "You mean I started, but the world lurched. For a blink I saw a dozen faces, my grandmother's among them, leaning down to watch me, their mouths moving as if chanting. The tallies on the page multiplied before my eyes until the ledger looked like a skin mapped in tiny cuts. The old man's voice was a thread. "You never stopped. You think you were just reading. You think you came to look. But names need hands." I scrambled backward, tripping on the grave marker, and for a moment I thought I'd broken free. Then I saw it. My handwriting, older and more certain than my own, looping across the ledger in a line that hadn't been there before, the same slanted, hurried scrawl that had been adding names in the night. The final flourish of that signature shuddered into view and matched the ink on my palm exactly. My lungs filled with cold air that tasted of iron. I understood then in a way I felt in my bones rather than my head, understood with a clarity that made my teeth ache, that this ledger didn't record deaths. It recorded the work I had done. The names that appeared were not people who had been taken by accident or by fate. They were the people I had guided, sometimes gently, sometimes with the terrible efficiency of shovel and night, into the dark. And the tallies, they were not counts of time. They were counts of how many times I had let them go. The old man watched me with unreadable eyes. Beside him, the trees moved though there was no wind, and from somewhere under the earth came the low, steady sound of a shovel hitting dirt. I tried to speak, but my voice wasn't mine. It came out as if from under a blanket. "Why can't I remember?" I whispered. He shrugged in that slow way old men do when they are tired of explaining the mechanics of a curse. "Because you need to want to be doing it for it to be done," he said. "The ledger keeps the will clean. It makes sure you don't stop." He tipped his head toward the shed. "You wanted answers, didn't you? To know where your family went. Now you know." I looked at the ledger again. My initials were there, clear as a birthmark, and beneath them a single, neat line had been written in the familiar hand. Signed, E. Carter. I tried to pull my hands away, to run like I never had, but the old man only smiled sadly and began to hum. A tune my grandmother had hummed to me as a child, one I hadn't heard since before I could remember. As the sound wrapped around my name, the edges of the world softened. Where the ledger lay open, the ink on the page glowed faintly, like words on a page that knew the shape of your life before you did. I don't know how long I stood there, the ledger's pages turning under a wind that wasn't there, the tallies stacking like the teeth of a comb. I only know what came afterward, that in the morning the shovel stood propped by the grave, damp earth still clinging to its blade, and that my palms were stained in a way I couldn't wash away. When I read the ledger later that day, my signature was dry and permanent. Beside it, in the same hand, someone had written a final note, terrible in its simplicity. Complete. There's a cemetery in northern Vermont called Fairview Rest, and for years it was little more than a name to me. A road sign I passed on my way to work, a patch of overgrown grass that my headlights brushed in the early morning hours. But after what happened to my friend Kyle, Fairview became more than a landmark. It became the center of the one story I swore I'd never tell. Kyle and I worked nights at a small manufacturing plant outside town. He was restless, always chasing something strange to fill the hours, so when he discovered the old burial traditions of Fairview, he became obsessed. In the 1800s, they used safety coffins there, boxes equipped with little brass bells and chains, in case someone was buried alive by mistake. It was one of those old-world fears, but Fairview had taken it seriously. According to Kyle, some of those graves still had their bells intact, hidden under the grass. "Imagine hearing one ring," he said one night as we leaned against the hood of his car, the cemetery behind us black and silent. "Imagine knowing someone never really died." I laughed it off. But Kyle didn't. He bought a metal detector, spent nights sweeping the grass while I sat in the car listening to music. And then, one Thursday, he came pounding on my apartment door at 2 a.m, face pale, eyes wide. "I heard it," he whispered. "The bell." It rang. At first I thought he was joking, but his hands trembled as he pulled me outside. His car idled at the curb, headlights still on, trunk open with dirt smeared across the bumper. He begged me to come back with him, to listen, to prove he wasn't losing his mind. Against my better judgment, I went. Fairview was colder than usual that night. The grass glittered with frost under the moon, and every headstone cast a long, crooked shadow. Kyle led me past the older section where the stones leaned like drunks and stopped at a patch of ground that looked newly disturbed, though no grave markers stood nearby. He crouched low, finger pressed to the earth. Listen, he breathed. At first there was only silence, the kind that hums in your ears when the night is too still. Then I heard it, a faint metallic chime, delicate as wind through glass, rising up from under the soil. It was irregular, sometimes a single ding, sometimes two quick notes, like someone trying to keep rhythm with a failing heartbeat. My stomach turned to ice. It's probably just the wind, I said, though there was no breeze. Kyle's grin split wide across his face. I told you someone's down there. I tried to drag him back, but he dropped to his knees and clawed at the dirt. His nails shredded, his breath came in ragged bursts, and the more he dug, the louder the bell seemed to ring. The ground gave way under his hands like it had been freshly turned, though the cemetery kept no records of burials in that section for over 100 years. I stood frozen, torn between stopping him and running, until his fingers struck something solid. Metal. It was a coffin lid. Old, rusted, but intact. And there, threaded through a hole in the lid, was the frayed end of a chain that stretched up into the earth, the kind used to connect to the service bells. The chain quivered, still moving, though Kyle had stopped digging. We both stared. Then, without warning, the coffin shifted. Not the earth, not the dirt collapsing, the coffin itself. Something inside pushed up, warping the lid. The chain rattled furiously, the bell above ringing in a frenzy I felt in my bones. Kyle screamed and wrenched at the lid. I grabbed his shoulders, yelling for him to stop, but his strength was inhuman, frantic. The lid cracked open an inch, enough for a gust of air to escape. Hot, foul, like meat rotted in summer. And with it came a sound I will never forget, a wet, shuddering gasp. We ran. God help me. We ran without looking back. The next day, Kyle didn't show up for work. His car was found abandoned on the road near Fairview, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. No one saw him again. The police searched the area, questioned me, but I said nothing about the bells. Who would believe me? Weeks passed. I avoided the cemetery, but sometimes, late at night, I swore I could hear faint chimes drifting through the open window of my apartment, though Fairview lay miles away. My dreams filled with muffled gasps and the scrape of nails on wood. Then, 2 months later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address, just my name scrawled in jagged handwriting. Inside was a single piece of paper, stained and wrinkled. It read, "It wasn't empty. They were waiting. Now I'm waiting too. Don't let them ring for you." At the bottom was a fingerprint in dirt, or what I hoped was dirt. I burned the letter, but the sound of bells still follows me. Sometimes I hear them when no one else does, soft and insistent, like they're calling my name. And when I pass Fairview on the way to work, I swear the bells ring louder, as though someone beneath the ground knows I'm listening. But the real twist came last winter, when the cemetery installed new markers for unclaimed graves. I stopped my car and walked along the rows just to prove to myself there was nothing, that it was all in my head. And then I saw it, an unmarked stone near the spot where Kyle and I had dug, newly carved with a name. His name, Kyle Everett, 1994-2024. The worst part? At the base of his stone, hidden in the frost, was a small brass bell, and it was still ringing. When I was in college, I rented a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town, cheap enough for a broke student but with a view that unsettled my friends. From my window, across the narrow street, loomed the iron gates of Ridgewood Cemetery, a sprawling, hilly graveyard that had been in use since the early 1800s. Most people hated walking past it, especially at night, but I found it oddly calming at first. The silence of it, the way the headstones caught the moonlight like pale teeth. It felt like living across from history itself. That changed when I noticed the house. It sat tucked into the far corner of Ridgewood, half hidden by overgrown hedges and a dead elm tree that split down the middle. It was a small caretaker's cottage, built of red brick gone black with mildew. Most people assumed it had been abandoned decades ago, but every few nights I saw a faint orange glow in the upstairs window. At first, I thought it was just reflection from passing cars. Then one night at 3 in the morning, I saw a silhouette move across the curtain. The next day I asked the groundskeeper about it, an old man named Harris who came by in a rusted truck to mow the grass. He frowned when I mentioned the caretaker's house. "That place has been empty longer than I've been alive," he said. "No electricity, no water. They sealed it up years ago." He spat on the gravel, clearly eager to change the subject. But the light kept appearing, sometimes flickering like fire, sometimes steady as a lamp, and the more I looked, the more I noticed small changes in the cemetery itself. Fresh flowers on graves that hadn't had visitors in decades. A child's toy left at the base of a weathered angel statue, though no children ever entered after dark. Once, when I came home late from class, I swore I saw a figure in a black coat walking the gravel path toward the cottage, lantern swinging from its hand. By October, curiosity won. I jumped the gate one foggy night and walked toward the house with a flashlight. My breath clouded in the damp air, and the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes seemed too loud, echoing off the stones. When I reached the cottage, I saw that the door was chained shut, the padlock crusted with rust, but the window glowed faintly from within. I pressed my face to the glass. Inside, the room was lined with shelves sagging under the weight of ledgers, boxes, and faded photographs. A chair sat before the window, and in that chair, hunched over a candle stub, was a man. His face was pale and sunken, his hair thin as cobwebs, but his eyes were alive, darting across a leather-bound book in his lap. When he looked up, he saw me. I stumbled back, heart in my throat. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, and then he lifted the book slightly as if to show me. I ran, vaulting the gate and not stopping until I slammed my apartment door behind me. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, when I checked my backpack before class, there was something inside that hadn't been there before. A photograph. Black and white, edges curling, it showed the very cottage I had peered into. And in the window sat the same man, though the date scribbled on the back was 1928. I nearly threw it away, but some part of me needed to know. That night I went back, this time with a bolt cutter. The chain snapped easily. The air inside the cottage was damp, mold clinging to the walls. But the smell of smoke lingered as though a candle had only just been snuffed out. On the desk by the window lay the book I had seen, the caretaker's ledger. I opened it. Every page listed names, not of the dead, but of the living. Dates beside them, times written in careful script, and notes like, "Visited the West Gate," or "Spoke to Harris." And there, halfway down the page, was my name. Saw him at the window, 2:57 a.m. The pen stroke was fresh. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My flashlight beam swept across the shelves, catching other books, dozens of ledgers, each marked with a decade. My hands trembled as I pulled one out at random. Inside, the entries stretched back to 1861, generations of people, catalogued, watched. Sometimes their deaths were noted, sometimes not, but every person who had ever lived near Ridgewood was there, including my grandmother. Her entry read, "Spoke to child, promised return." The date matched a week before she died. I dropped the book and bolted for the door, but the chain was back, whole, locked tight. My flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in suffocating dark. Then came the sound, pages turning, slow and deliberate, though I hadn't touched the book. The air grew heavy, and in the faint glow from the window I saw him again, seated at the desk, candlelight staining his face. He hadn't moved from the chair. Maybe he'd never left it. His voice was a rasp of dust. Every watcher becomes what he sees. That's the way of it. I clawed at the door, but the sound of scratching filled the room, not behind me, not from the shelves, but from under the floorboards. Nails dragging wood, soft, muffled voices whispering in chorus, words I couldn't make out except for one. My name. The caretaker lifted a bony hand and pointed at the ledger. I looked down unwillingly, and there it was. My name again, now followed by a new note, the ink still wet. Stayed. Watching begins. I don't remember what happened after. Neighbors said they heard screams from the cemetery that night but found nothing. My apartment sat untouched for weeks until the landlord cleared it out. But I know this much. Sometimes, late at night, when people walk past Ridgewood, they swear they see a faint glow in the upstairs window of the caretaker's house. A silhouette hunched over a desk, candle burning low. And if they look closely, very closely, they'll see the face in the glass. Mine.